let's talk about the Khilafah. Let's talk about the Caliphate. But before we even start this conversation, we can't really talk about that as an ideal, as a concept, without first accepting the existing situation of the Ummah, which is we are 1.8 billion people. We are 50 countries, nation states. We have 50 nation states. The vast majority of the rulers and the regimes are in one of the pockets of the 5 superpowers of the world, and that is America, Russia, China, Britain and France to a lesser extent. If they are not in the pockets of those 5 countries, then they're in the pockets of IMF, World Bank, who are ultimately funded and sustained by mainly America. That's the existing quo, existing status quo. The existing status quo is that the borders and the flags in which we take such great pride in are barely 100 years old. We have to also accept that whilst in many of these constitutions there'll be an explicit mentioning of Islam or the Quran being the state religion, or the ruler has to be a Muslim.
Like in Syria.
Like in Bangladesh as well. Bangladesh has the Quran mentioned in the constitution, but it says it is a secular country. Pakistan's constitution was pretty much the British constitution until certain tweaks were made later on, I believe. Under Bhutto, yeah. So what I'm saying to you is that can we even speak about the caliphate without first addressing the existing situation of the Muslim world?
Of course not. We need to address the current situation. So moving on from creedal unity
to now
and decreasing sectarian disunity, in the sense, because some people take two extremes. Some people think that when I say decreasing sectarian disunity entails that we acknowledge the false beliefs of the groups. When I'm mentioning it because of the Quran states وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. The command is from the Quran, وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. So the disunity comes from the people who cause the disunity. But then the disunity needs to be addressed. Moving on from that, we go on to political disunity, in the sense that a young man born in Pakistan is raised thinking that the Pakistani flag represents Islam. Using Pakistan as a prototype example.
It's a good example.
It's a very good example.
It's a good example.
Then similarly, thinking that the Pakistani army was created to free Palestine or to free Kashmir. And the Pakistani army has a religious, the motive of the deen of Allah. So you have the likes of Mir Zahid and others promoting the Pakistani army as the army of Khurasan, even though Pakistan geographically doesn't fall into Khurasan. Afghanistan and Iran fall into Khurasan. Yeah. Now this person is raised with saluting the flag, almost like a takbir. Every morning, nationalism is a disease that has entered the hearts of so many Muslims that they cannot think out of the paradigm of nationalism. To the extent when I wrote my book, Navigating the End of Time, in the introduction, I mention Kashmir.
Yep.
A Pakistani nationalist, in one of the comments on Amazon, he mentions that I am disappointed that Shaykh Asrar refers to Kashmir separately to Pakistan. So he's reading, I am mentioning Kashmir as a district, geographical district. So you could go to any part of the world as a Muslim, of the Muslim world, and we as Muslims would see them as equals. So I write in Damascus, I'm in Damascus, not as a nationalist. But this person is framing that as a nationalist, that why has he not recognized Kashmir as Pakistan? That's an issue for him. But for me, an issue would be, why is Pakistan, instead of being a nationalistic state, a state that calls for patriotism to the state, as opposed to loyalty to Allah, which is the difference between Khilafah and a nation state. A nation state calls for loyalty to itself as an entity. while the Khilafah calls for what? Loyalty to Allah. The bay'ah is to the Khalifa because the bay'ah is to Allah. And even the Khalifa is not above the law. So this distinction alone should bring into our minds that nation states are disuniting the Muslim Ummah. So we need to remove the illness of nation states where people are prioritizing a flag or an anthem or a constitution. None of these things have a place in the deen of Islam. The Khilafah is the only form of governance recognized in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.